Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Center for Global Health as we host our Understanding Global Health Research Funding webinar. We're delighted to have you join us. Before we jump into our fantastic event, I just want to go over a few housekeeping notes. We will save questions towards the end of each session. So if you could please utilize the Q&A box, which is found at the bottom of your screen, and we'll continue to monitor any comments or questions throughout the chat. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderator for today, Dr. Glenn Galton, our Center Director. Glenn?
Well, welcome everyone. I want to, really just thank everybody, all of our presenters and panelists today, but also welcome to folks around both at Penn, around the US, and our international colleagues who are dialing in. I was just describing to some of our colleagues that really today's intent is to create a practical guide for everybody, and we're going to walk through a variety of different mechanisms. We all are doing, I think, really meaningful work, and sometimes, not sometimes, but most of the time, it's a challenge to corral the funding to keep things going, to get it started and to keep things going. So today is really a practical guide to that. So I want to encourage everybody, as Aleo mentioned, to ask questions. Please list them in the in the chat room so that we can see them, and then we can guide them to both our lead speakers and our panelists. So we're going to kick it off with Chris Karp. Chris is the Director of Global Health Discovery and Translational Science at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Chris has been at Gates since I think it was like 2012. So it's been a little while. His background, he's a physician, immunologist, infectious disease guy. Prior to his time at Gates, like many of us, he served his time in academia down at our good friends to the south of Philly at Johns Hopkins. So Chris has just been a wonderful colleague for so many folks around the world, and so we're looking forward to hearing your presentation today. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for that very warm introduction. Let me get this out of my screen. Okay, so for those who've actually been to Seattle and been to the Gates Foundation building there, it's this lovely large building with huge glass walls. But I will say, despite that, I find that the foundation is fairly opaque from the outside to most people. So my goal today is to do what my title is here, to demystify the Gates Foundation, how we work, why we work, and how funding is done. So if you go to the next slide. The foundation was founded on a bedrock belief that all lives have equal value. And as a result, for its 20-year history, it's aimed at tackling some of the greatest inequities in our increasingly fractured world. In approach, it's guided in many ways by the Sustainable Development Goals, as everybody knows, a set of commitments made by every country in the UN to their citizens, with a particular focus by the Foundation on catalyzing scientific and technological innovation that can have an outsized impact on global health and development. Next slide. And if I stand back and ask what the real comparative advantages of the Foundation are, I put them in 4 categories. The first, again, gets to this fundamental belief in transformational innovation. And this not just at the level of science and technology, but much more broadly. So as many may know, one of the first big things that the Foundation did was help set up Gavi, so novel financing for vaccine introduction in places that were not getting introduction. So that's number one. The second, I put in the lane of risk capital, the ability to work at levels of risk with resources that pharma won't touch, that governments find very difficult to fund often given their short election cycles. And again, to be able to work at timescales that others find difficult, whether it's getting significant funds to WHO within 24 hours at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, or working on very long time horizons. Melinda announced in 2007 that the goal of the foundation in malaria was eradication of falciparum malaria, looking at a time horizon at the moment around 2045. Third is really fairly powerful convening power and voice. And what's really developed over the last 20 years is deep technical expertise. The foundation really started as a grant-giving organization, I will say, on the order of, well, we think there's an e-tech vaccine is needed, path, here's $50 million, do something. That was never terribly successful. And what's been built up over the last 20 years is deep internal technical expertise to be able to do much more investing for impact, being deep in the data flow and driving things. Next slide. So just at the highest level, I mean, this is a family-led foundation, and Bill and Melinda are deeply engaged in terms of setting strategy. In the last couple of years, there's a broader board, which I've listed here just for knowledge. The CEO, Mark Sussman, is there ex officio, and there's a much broader panel now of trustees from around the world, including folks like Strive Masaiwa, for example, a powerful voice for vaccine equity during the pandemic. So next slide here. 2 points here. This is a pie chart view of the budget from 2022. About $7.5 billion went out the door in terms of charitable spend. The main point here is just to situate the center of gravity of the foundation in the global program. So you see a variety of divisions here: global development, global health, global growth and opportunity, global policy and advocacy, and the most recent set up division, gender equality, which is also a global program. There's a much smaller US program which is funded, which is focused on education in the US. So, $7.5 billion sounds like a lot. Of course, it pales both in regards to the underlying need, but also budgets like the NIH, which I think was $47 billion last year. And so in the global programs, fundamentally, the funding is very tightly focused on a set of strategies. And if you go to the next slide, I've listed the main strategic foci in the global programs here down the left. I think of things coming on to strategy at the foundation through a set of filters. The first, again, gets to the fundamental equity agenda, those conditions causing the greatest burden of morbidity, mortality among the poorest of the poor, and that by the best data possible. So the foundation has put actually hundreds of millions of dollars into much better ground truth epidemiologic data and modeling things like what do children under the age of 5 die of in sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera. So that's the first filter. The second is that other groups aren't putting commensurate attention against those problems. There's a wave of type 2 diabetes sweeping the tropics at the moment, but many, many other groups are putting significant resources into that. And the third, frankly, just gets back to the fundamental belief in the transformational power of science and technology. On the right-hand side, I've put the very highest line goals of these various strategies. So for polio malaria, it's eradication. For HIV and TB, it's acceleration of the ongoing reduction in transmission rates. For the next two, syndromic diseases and those under the age of 2, it's reduction of disease burden against specific pathogens that cause the greatest burden of disease. In the London Declaration Group of Neglected Tropical Diseases, it's very pathogen specific. So with West African trypanosomiasis and dracunculiasis, it's eradication. For the filarial diseases, it's in WHO speak, elimination is a public health problem. And for the rest, it's reduction of burden. So these top strategies are all focused on either specific infectious diseases or infectious syndromes. The next really get to underlying biological and social underlying vulnerabilities. So the next 3, maternal neonatal child health, pretty clear here, maximizing maternal and neonatal health and developmental potential. The newest strategy is the women's health innovations, fundamentally aiming at extensive burden of preventable reproductive and sexual diseases. Family planning, and the next here, water sanitation and hygiene. There's agriculture, which is both crops and livestock, nutrition, and finally, financial services for the poor. So a pretty broad portfolio, but again, a well-limited portfolio to maximize the ability to have impact. So if you go to the next slide, if you take it down one level in each strategy, and I should say there's a so-called program strategy team, or PST is the acronym around each of these. If you go down one level, there's a deeply worked out strategy which gets pressure tested every year or two. So here is the highest level view of the strategic vision in the HIV program. Again, the major goal is to accelerate the reduction in the incidence of HIV infection in high burden geographies, with the goal of achieving sustained epidemic control. Really in two parts then. So on the left here, reduction of onward transmission by supporting HIV-infected individuals to achieve and maintain viral suppression. And on the right, prevention of new HIV infection in uninfected individuals. Under the former, large efforts in testing and linkage. So finding folks at highest HIV risk, linking those that are positive to effective viral suppression treatment and those who are negative to effective prevention. In terms of preventing new HIV infection, this is where the R&D effort is. Probably, in my estimation, what is going to be the first really transformational tool here is long-acting high-efficacy PrEP, so depot PrEP. And we're on the cusp of that, I would say. We've been working on vaccines, as the whole world has for about 40 years. I would say, in some ways, like fusion power, it's only 10 or 20 years away. Also working on biologics in this space as well. Working in terms of product launch, again, of what is closest, we think, which are PrEP interventions, and on the downstream side, promoting scaling and sustained coverage of voluntary male medical circumcision, and again, work on optimizing the global and country architecture to support effective prevention. All this needs to rest on really good data and modeling of burden in a very fine-grained way, and programmatic progress and performance, as well as assuring that the global funding is there, always at risk. Next slide. Maybe we'll skip over this. This is a fundamental look at the malaria strategy. Yeah, let's go to this. So a bit of an org chart here to maybe help clear up some things that are often difficult to understand from the outside. Down the center, I put those same strategies in terms of the program strategy teams that drive them. Put them down the center. I've color-coded them as to which division they report into, which is not necessarily a need-to-know kind of thing, but perhaps helpful. So blue reports into global health, yellow reports into the newest division, which is gender equality, brown into global development, and green into global growth and opportunity. One way of thinking, in some ways, where these report into and why is that in the global health, the center of gravity remains largely in the upstream R&D space, whereas in global development, it's much more downstream. Although, as you see polio here, this is, as you know, deep in the eradication agenda. So it's one of the largest budgets of the foundation, and most of that is in delivery. But even there, we've been doing upstream work. The new genetically more stable oral poliovirus vaccine, OPV2, was generated in our group starting about 10 years ago and is now in 700 million infants. So the PSTs are responsible for generating and driving the strategy, and in some way responsible for everything from the most upstream R&D through delivery, where that's part of the strategy. But like many pharma, we are matrixed, and cutting across these PSTs are a variety of functions. So I lead discovery and translational sciences. Our purview is everything from the most upstream R&D through proof of concept in human. There's a vaccine development group, a drug development group that has the regulatory function labeled integrated development here, a very upstream DARPA-ish biotech scanning group called the Biotech Accelerator, a large group of modelers, the Institute for Disease Modeling, which is incredibly helpful to us, and a strategy planning management group. In the more downstream space, in global development, for example, there is the global health agencies and funds, as well as primary healthcare and immunization. There are country and regional offices. And I guess the other thing I want to point out here is the Strategic Investment Fund. We do a lot of our funding through grants and contracts, but we're also able to actually take equity in biotech. We're frequently angel investors to get global access and de-risk technologies we think may be useful. This is also the group that does advanced market commitments with pharma. Next. Yeah, just to say, this is not readable, I'm sure, but this is the current state of the global health development product portfolio. Just to point out, it's huge. It's pretty much the size of a pharma like Novartis or GSK. Next slide. And this is us. So discovery and translational sciences, our fundamental job, as I think I've said, is to fund the development of those transformational tools, drugs, biologics, vaccines, microbiome interventions, et cetera, to help the PSTs achieve their goals, the goals of their strategies. And I will say that if the foundation can work at levels of risk that others find difficult, we have extra license on that. So we work at the goals of the strategies and generally along the lines of the strategies, but often off-piste. A classic comment being, well, that's not on strategy, unless, of course, it works, in which case the strategy will change. So we fund both the discovery and translation of a pipeline of products. We fund as well state-of-the-art underlying cross-cutting platforms to support product discovery and translation. We spend a lot of effort on de-risking novel technologies, both for products and for the underlying platforms. And whereas we hope to always stand on the shoulders of blue sky science funded by NIH or MRC or Howard Hughes, often, as you all know, in global health, there's fundamental biological ignorance in many of our problems. So we do fund upstream work. We are, discovery is set up in a variety of domains. Two are product centric, so a drug discovery group under Ken Duncan, and vaccines and biologics, newly under Hedda Wardeman. So two product-centric domains, one topic-centric domain in sexual and reproductive health technologies under Sharon Achilles. The foundation long talked about putting women and girls at the center of development, and it seemed to me there are a variety of equity issues in women's health that were not being addressed. And so I set this up, and this now has this as downstream partner, PST partner, the Women's Health Technologies Group. So three domains that I've mentioned, and then cutting across three functional domains within the function. So the Global Health Discovery Collaboratory, which I'll get back to, Translational Sciences Group, and Global Partnerships and Grand Challenges, and I'll talk a bit about each of those. So next slide. So in the drug discovery group, there are four main initiatives. There's some minor things as well, but this is where the bulk of the effort is: TB, malaria, antivirals, and non-hormonal contraceptives. The TB Drug Accelerator is the most mature program. It's been going on now for about 14 years. 14 years ago, the TB drug pipeline was essentially bare. And this has been an incredibly successful program. So this is a groundbreaking collaboration between 6 pharma companies, a couple of biotechs, 16 academic institutions, and a product development partner to facilitate early TB drug discovery. You know, the product target profile that we're aiming at is quite a barrier, but I actually think we're going to get there fairly soon. So the fundamental desire here is a set of 3 drugs, new drugs, that can be given to anybody with TB. So irrespective of strain and previous resistance, for 2 months or less, that is safe enough to be given in the absence of monitoring of things like liver function tests, and is affordable, of course. Everything we do is aimed at things that are affordable, deliverable, et cetera, in our populations. So far, this integrated program, which took quite some time to get the partnership going across all these groups and data sharing, et cetera, and real integration of tools across the value chain. So far, 12 drug candidates have come out of this, and 8 are still in development, and the pipeline remains full. So there's the TB drug accelerator, a similar malaria drug accelerator, which is, again, aiming at something pretty high. The idea here is a single encounter cure, radical cure and prevention. So single combination of drugs given once that will both cure as well as prevent infection for the next few weeks. The newest on the block is the antivirals for pandemic preparedness, coming out of the work that was begun during the COVID pandemic. This is a partnership with the Novo Nordisk Foundation and Open Philanthropies as co-funders, and aiming here at coronaviruses, influenza, and paramyxoviruses. And Sarah Cherry may have more to say on that. And finally, the non-hormonal contraceptives initiative, a perfect Mount Everest for the foundation to help climb. So huge need here, a space that pharma hasn't been in for decades, and real promise. Next slide. So there are 4 major initiatives, but underlying this, as I said, are a variety of cross-cutting platforms brought to bear. So a couple anchor partners, Caliber at Scripps. We set up the Global Health Drug Discovery Institute in Beijing, co-funded by the Beijing government and located at Tsinghua University. On the right, a variety of other biotechs, pharma and others bringing stuff to the party. So for capacity, both Caliber and Giddy, also H3D in Cape Town and the Dundee Drug Discovery Unit, a variety of platforms, DNA encoded libraries, free energy perturbation modeling, et cetera, and chemical diversity, a variety of approaches to chemical diversity. And we've done a lot of work in AI-based drug discovery with the groups shown here. There's promise, but again, a little unclear what we'll get out of it. Vaccines and biologics, again, across the bottom here, you see the engagement across essentially all of the human health related strategies in the vaccines and biologics space. And on top, some of the cross-cutting bodies of work. We, for example, had been funding mRNA vaccines with essentially all of the major players since about 2014, which finally got over the finish line, as we know, initial finish line in COVID, similarly with nanoparticle delivery platforms and structure-guided design. Maybe just to move on, looking at the time here, underlying the vaccine work as well, a variety of platforms, biotechs and academic groups that bring specific things to the party for the grantees in this space, whether it's adjuvants and formulations or antibody dynamics, systems immunology through the group at Stanford, humanized immunoglobulin mice, et cetera. Next slide. The major focus of the Reproductive Health Technologies Group are some major programs in vaginal microbiome interventions, a space that has been missing some really deep science, and we're actually now finally going into experimental medicine trials with interventions later this year. Similarly, HPV therapeutic vaccines. So the foundation's role in HPV, cervical cancer prevention, has been heavily over the last years on the prophylactic vaccine, both a variety of approaches, both developing country vaccine manufacture production of HPV prophylactic vaccine to bring supplies way up and cost way down, as well as following data from the initial efficacy trials, as well as a stopped efficacy trial in India, which suggested that single dosing, as opposed to 2 to 4 doses, was sufficient for protection. So doing the clinical studies to nail that and taking that all the way to WHO recommendations last year of single dose, which of course has huge implications for the ability for uptake of the vaccine. That said, even with the most optimistic modeling of prophylactic vaccine uptake, there's a huge burden of morbidity mortality for the next 30 or 40 years. So we're working now on an initiative for an HIPD therapeutic vaccine. So not the space that people generally think of in terms of use in high-grade lesions or cervical cancer, but a vaccine, a CD8-driven vaccine that could be given to all women of a certain age who had sexual debut before availability of prophylactic vaccine. Next slide. I mentioned the Global Health Discovery Collaboratory. This is fundamentally aimed at assuring that the frontiers of technological innovation are brought early in a concerted way to the global health problem set, and fundamentally that the grantees working in this space have access to those technologies, easy access. We also work to foster collaborative networks of grantees and platforms and centers of excellence. Let's move on. Translational Sciences Group, a group really to ensure that anything that is product related has eyes on it from the very beginning in terms of what the development path is, biomarker discovery, the integrated clinical development plan, et cetera. And one more slide. Discovery, actually, the Discovery Group started with the original Grand Challenges in Global Health 20 years ago. We still do those open branded RFP programs, although focused largely these days either in very new areas of investigation or largely in the geographies that we focus on, which is Africa and South Asia, through GC Africa, GC India, et cetera. This group spends most of its time these days actually on low and middle income country ecosystem strengthening. Final slide, I think. No, I wanted to mention the other kind of upstream discovery group at the foundation, which is in the maternal and child health space. This was actually hived off from Discovery. We did that about 5 years ago, bringing some folks from other groups that were doing allied work in enterics and pneumonia. So this is the discovery group for the MNCH crowd. And if you go to the next slide, the focus here really is shifting from the infectious syndromes to the underlying vulnerabilities, intervening early in the life course and prioritizing prevention over treatment. I've listed below by kind of life course what they focus on. So in pregnancy, it's anemia, undernutrition, and preeclampsia. In the perinatal period, it's postpartum hemorrhage and anemia, sepsis in moms, and in neonates, stillbirth, preterm birth, sepsis, hypoxic encephalopathy. And in infancy, again, this nexus of underweight, wasting, stunting, mortality, and optimal or suboptimal neurodevelopment. Finally, how do we fund? Again, academics tend to know the grand challenges or grand challenges explorations, these open branded RFPs. As I've mentioned, we still do these, but this is a tiny fraction. Even in discovery, it's probably 1% to 2% of what we fund. Much more often, it's closed RFPs. These are the 4 groups in the world that we think can probably answer the question. Very targeted investments in focused areas. I mentioned we take equity often in biotech program-related investments. The Gates Medical Research Institute was set up in Cambridge a few years ago as a integrated development partner for those interventions that don't have any commercial potential, and so pharma is unlikely to work with us. So we work with them. We engage with product development partners. We work with pharma, biotech, multilaterals, co-funders. We fund a lot of platform technologies. One thing to say about our fundamental grants, though, is we are unlike most granting organizations. It's not a question of sending in a proposal and having a committee read it and giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Again, we are deep in the data flow and deep in shaping what we're interested in, a shaping process that we do with potential grantees. So it's not a yes or no. It's basically how can something be built that's going to potentially have impact. And I think that's my last slide. One more? Yes. So I'm a couple minutes over, so I should shut up.
No worries, Chris. Thanks very much. Actually, I think there are some questions that have been popping up, and I've got my list as well, but I think some of them may be addressed by our panelists. So hang in there, and we'll hit the questions kind of along with the panelists. So we're fortunate to have 3 Penn faculty who have participated in Gates-funded initiatives: Sarah Cherry, David Roos, and Harsha Thumurthy. And I won't introduce them all individually and their various titles. Let's just say that they're all wonderful colleagues now, all senior folks at Penn who have a long history working in the global health space generally, but again, with familiarity to Gates. Sarah, I'm going to turn to you first and maybe ask you to just very quickly describe the work that you've done with Gates, and David and Harsha, for you as well, when I turn to you, how did you become aware of the Gates initiative that you ended up participating in? I think just think about this from a practical perspective about how you came to understand, because I think, as Chris was saying in the beginning, from the outside world at times, and I'm not picking on Gates, it's true of a lot of foundations and agencies, it does seem impenetrable at times. So Sarah?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Glenn. So actually, I think I ended up working with the Gates Foundation in a slightly unusual way, although maybe everybody's story is the same, that there isn't necessarily a direct path. But during the coronavirus pandemic, we had begun to do a lot of drug screening at Penn, looking for repurposing agents against SARS-CoV-2. And we began to work with Medicines for Malaria Venture, who has worked with the Gates Foundation for, I think it's since its inception, and maybe the Gates helped to start it. I'm not actually sure of the history. And in working with Medicines for Malaria Venture, where they were sending me compounds and sending me libraries that they had, I think that they actually contacted the Gates Foundation to tell them what I was doing. And then folks from the Gates Foundation then contacted me to talk about whether or not I could partner with them in testing additional libraries. So they've had a long-standing relationship with Caliber, who created the Reframe library. And so basically, Gates ended up sort of like a partnering institution that helped me to be able to test compound libraries that the Gates Foundation had a lot of interest in. And so that started my partnership with them, where they helped to fund a lot of that research in SARS-CoV-2 work during the pandemic. And then subsequently, I really enjoyed those interactions. I had bi-weekly meetings with them where they gave me feedback on the approaches that we were using, and I really got a lot out of that. And so when they decided to move into henipaviruses, which are another emerging pathogen for which we really have no knowledge, my program officer at the time, Rob Jordan, told me about it. And then I began to figure out if I could work in that space, and basically submitted a proposal. And now I'm working with the Gates Foundation on henipaviruses, which are another really important emerging pathogen. So it's sort of, I was match made by another global health organization that helped me to now work with them. And I've really enjoyed all of my interactions.
Yeah, Chris, how typical is that as contrasted to what most of us are more conditioned to do, therefore more familiar, which is, we write a proposal, which I know, and then it gets reviewed yet up or down, which I know isn't the Gates perspective. But essentially, Sarah came in through this, partner pathway. Is that typical, or, I mean, how do folks who,
not uncommon. We try to have our tentacles out. We have folks at the foundation from all over with deep technical expertise in a variety of areas. And so we hope to have, our ear to the ground on who's doing what. We often travel around as well, although I would say it's since before the pandemic, I was last at Penn to talk with folks there. Yeah. But we use folks we know in various places as well to help us with this kind of surveillance of what's happening. And of course, we read the literature assiduously. But so it's not uncommon. I mean, COVID itself was an uncommon event, and coming in to do antiviral work through MMV is unusual, but the basic principle is not.
Yeah.
We've actually have a couple programs in in the Bay Area, in Boston, in London, and in India, where there's folks who are well positioned to see what's happening locally, kind of keep an eye out for us.
Yeah.
So.
David, why don't you give us a little bit of an entree? You have a longer history with the foundation in a slightly different way than Sarah, although obviously, you know, pathogen related. But
certainly, my history of support with the foundation actually is very similar to Sarah's, in something that was established in keeping with foundation goals and initiatives. I'll say a word about that in a minute. But my initial interactions with the foundation were more as a reviewer and a consultant. I was one of the, I led some of the reviews of some of the initial Grand Challenges programs, 20 years ago or something like that, and have been involved with the foundation as a consultant in one form or another in a variety of ways. I was on the scientific board for the Medicines for Malaria venture from its inception and for the first decade of its work. So like Sarah, our involvement has largely come as a result of initiatives at the foundation. In my case, I think the first financial support we had from the foundation was for establishing the trypanosome database resources, which grew out of an initiative at the foundation to try to assess why it was that drugs for diseases like trypanosomiasis were not making as rapid progress as work on malaria. And at that time, one of the findings was that access to genomic scale data sets was a limiting factor. And because we were responsible for providing these resources for malaria, we were asked whether we could do something similar for the Candida, which we did, and which the foundation made clear from the very outset that they viewed this as an essential platform for the global research community, but long-term support was not in the cards, that they would help pay to get something set up, but that it needed to find its own funding over the longer term, which indeed it has for the subsequent almost 20 years. So if I can maybe jump the gun a little bit, Glenn, to provide a word of suggestion or advice for attendees at this conference, I would say perhaps the first thing that I try to highlight to people who ask me about funding from the Gates Foundation, who are more familiar with working in a research space like the NIH or the MRC, or the NH and MRC, or the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, or whatever, is it's important to keep in mind that the Gates Foundation is a foundation with their own goals that Chris did a very nice job of articulating. Their goal is not to support research in Sarah's lab, however exciting and interesting that research is. Their goal is to advance their public health mission in ways that may, for a time, overlap with what it is that Sarah does. But it's important to keep in mind that that's a very different set of goals and criteria than those that are used for funding, say, NIH research projects. Maybe just 1 second more, that this was very evident, for example, when I worked with the Medicines for Malaria venture, where it was very clear that there were a lot of exciting projects that emerged out of academic research labs. But of course, if the moment it becomes clear that a compound is not going to be a drug, there's no reason to continue funding that project, even if I've committed to a postdoc or a graduate student for work on their PhD. What's more, even if that project is highly successful and we clearly demonstrate, let's say, mechanism of action and want to advance something into from a hit to a lead, the next phase for that project may be putting 50 synthetic chemists on the generation of new lead compounds, and that is not work that's going to happen in my lab. So it's important to keep in mind that the goals of the foundation are very different from those of NIH.
Yeah, no, very well said. And I think that perspective going in is important, because I think a lot of people look and say, well, how do I get funded from Gates? But the reality is, it isn't necessarily convincing them like it is some of the federal funding agencies in different countries. It's a different pathway. Harsha, let's turn to you. For those that don't know Harsha, he's actually an economist and works in the space of some degree infectious disease, but also women and children's health. Harsha, how did you become? Maybe you could just say a little bit about your work with Gates and how it fits, et cetera, and how you came to this, because again, you come from a slightly different perspective than David and Sarah.
Right. Yeah. So thanks, Glenn, and thank you, Chris, for sharing your perspective. It's really helpful to hear that. So as Glenn mentioned, I'm an economist. So I've been working at the intersection of health and economics, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa now for about 20 years, and I've been fortunate to have multiple grants from the Gates Foundation, going back to about 12 years or so. And to some degree, what I have to say, it sort of builds on what Sarah and David just shared, which is that, and also your concluding slide, Chris, which is that many of my grants from the Gates Foundation have stemmed from forming a relationship, getting to know a program officer, either directly meeting them at conferences. So again, in the interest of giving advice, I think getting to know program officers from the Gates Foundations when you're at conferences is worthwhile. I've also sometimes been connected to the foundation through partner organizations that I work with in Africa who already have funds from the Gates Foundation. And paying attention to the strategic priorities. So let me just tell you about the first grant I had from the Gates Foundation. This had to do with medical male circumcision, which, Chris, you pointed out is one of the foundation's priorities. And their priority has been to take this proven intervention, voluntary medical male circumcision, and support its scale up. And the foundation was very interested in demand creation efforts for medical male circumcision. And so when I was working in Kenya, I was talking to several partner organizations that were engaged in male circumcision delivery about what could be done to promote take-up. And it so happened that that was also a very high priority for the Gates Foundation's HIV program at the time. And I think that led to a conversation about, well, who are you working with in Kenya? What are the intervention ideas that you have in mind? Can you carry out a study that's going to generate evidence that will be useful for the Ministry of Health, for PEPFAR? And that, I think, is what ultimately led to the foundation investing in that project. It's also, I think, one of the benefits in that case was we were able to move very quickly. I think in that case, the time from like the discussions of the actual research project design to funding was much more rapid than it would have been through NIH. I also say that in another case, I have responded to one of those RFPs, and you mentioned, Chris, that it's not a very common mechanism, but the Grand Challenges Explorations competition was a chance for me to put out something that was really ambitious, didn't have any preliminary data. Not sure it would have ever gotten funded by NIH because it came with all kinds of risks and uncertainties. But ultimately, that $100,000 grant from the Gates Foundation led to several NIH R01s because we generated preliminary data. So I think that's my kind of main advice is look at the strategic priorities that the foundation has. Try to get your ideas in front of a program officer or a partner who's working very closely with the Gates Foundation. I guess if I had a question for Chris, one, it would be sort of why is it that the foundation has not resorted as much to the kind of RFP model? It's something I would like to see a little bit more of because to some degree, the like getting to know a program officer part does require you to be in the right place at the right time kind of thing.
A degree of stalking is not.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And tell me if you disagree with that. Yeah.
No, so We've used them, as I mentioned, more these days in our geographies, where I mean, we have a fundamental push at the moment for partner diversity, and clearly the scientists in our geographies, and those communities are, although we have a bunch of folks in scientists in our regional offices who know the communities fairly well, we haven't explored the breadth of innovation there in similar ways. I think when things get more, when we're deeper into an area and tend to know in some sense what the lay of the land is, the amount of bureaucracy it takes to go through, you know, the 2,000 responses to any RFP to get the 2 or 3 is probably weighs on that side. So we still use them, especially in new areas, I would say, new explorations, but less.
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that, Harsha. Good question. We have a couple comments in the Q&A. So Chris, I'm going to read them. They're really directed to you. So kind of in reverse order. So Steve Avery asks, people with HIV/AIDS have an increased risk of developing cervical cancer. Does the Gates Foundation fund research to address the outcomes of HIV/AIDS?
Yeah, so I would say that I guess the link there is in terms of the therapeutic vaccine. Absolutely, those with HIV/AIDS have a much higher incidence and a quicker speed of moving to cervical cancer. So in terms of the therapeutic vaccine initiative, clearly it's not going to, the TPP has to be that it's efficacious as well in the presence of HIV infection.
Right, right. Yeah, so Steve, I suspect you're still listening online. Yeah, so the foundation, as Chris mentioned at the very beginning, is really not focused on cancer care. It's prevention, and especially those associated with infectious diseases. That actually brings me to a question, and I will ask the other one in the Q&A in a second. But Chris, how often among your leadership panel, or maybe you guys curate folks to sort of channel this a bit, how often does the conversation come up about whether the foundation should broaden into more NCDs? And does that, I'm sure that must happen at some level, right? At an executive level? Constantly.
I mean, on the one hand, I would say that nobody's ever made a convincing case to me that the foundation works on too few things. That said, there are things that we have gotten on strategy in the last few years. We have not really gotten into the NCD space. Right. And I think that will take some time if it happens. You know, if polio was eradicated right now, the next thing would be measles eradication.
There you go.
If I were Bill or Melinda, I might have started with measles, but it turns out I'm neither Bill nor Melinda.
What about rubella?
Yeah. Well, I mean, MR is what's used no matter what. So
yeah,
and we are preparing, right? In terms of tools, one of the problems with measles vaccine delivery is that it's done fixed post, right? Because you need to reconstitute. Yeah. So we've been working on microneedle patches for better campaign work.
Yeah, I mean, this tracks back to, I think David said it really well. I mean, the foundation has to set the guidelines. 7 billion is a lot, but it's not an unlimited amount of money. And, you guys have stayed focused and true to form. So I'm not surprised that the NCD conversations don't happen, but it does, doing that takes away from other things. And there's plenty of need areas going around. So let me get to actually the first question we received, which is, so thanks for the presentation. The WHO is currently considering including NOMA among the NTDs by September 2023. Do you consider that the inclusion of this disease into the NTDs would determine a modification of the foundation's priorities?
No, it's fundamentally a question of amount of degree of burden. NOMA, of course, is a horrendous horrendous intersection of malnutrition and infection, but it's not going to rise to the top in terms of it'd be the underlying work on optimal nutrition as opposed to a specific.
Yeah.
I guess one thing to point out is there's maybe some apparent tension between describing something as an equity organization and maybe utilitarian considerations. What do I mean? Often with any particular intervention for something that's on strategy, it's a question of prioritization based on incremental dollars for a disability adjusted life year, a DALY saved, right? And so how can you get the biggest bang for your buck? And in some sense, that can run across the equity agenda, and that, take vaccine delivery. If you're looking for the biggest bang for your buck, you may tend to ignore the most marginalized, vulnerable people who are harder to get to, right? Which you don't want to do.
Yeah.
On the flip side of that is the NTDs. I mean, if you stack the DALY burden of all the current NTDs, together, it's less than a third of that of malaria. The real reason to be working on NTDs is it's not the poorest of the poor, it's the poorest of the poorest of the poor that tend to really suffer the consequences of NTD infection. So,
yeah.
And there's actually some phenomenal modeling. The foundation had funded, based on surprising results from trachoma eradication work with azithromycin that seemed to show a mortality benefit of just a couple of doses of azithromycin. The foundation funded a variety of studies to nail that. And in fact, in areas with high infant and young child mortality rates, azithromycin actually shows real benefit in preventing death. But recent modeling in some sites, in terms of distance of folks from a medical center, showed that both the burden as well as the benefit is those who are much farther away from the medical center, which makes some kind of sense. And if you integrate that with it, then given that the greater benefit is those who are harder to reach, in fact, that kind of elides the difference or the potential tension between equity and utilitarianism.
Yeah.
Anyway, so fascinating modeling that'll be published soon.
Yeah, cool. David, did you want to make your point? You wrote something in the chat. Why don't you make that point?
Oh, I just wanted to point out that because we have a diversity of participants listening in on this call, just a couple of acronyms that may not be familiar to everyone. The TPP that Chris described, a target product profile, is pharma industry lingo for identification of what the goal or the target is. For example, a single dose radical cure for malaria. That's not to say that there aren't many other strategies for anti-malarials that would be useful for prophylaxis or whatever, but that specific target product profile is important. And I trust that NTD is probably clear to people of neglected tropical diseases, but which include a variety of infections, such as the worm-based infections Chris mentioned.
Sorry for the
Yeah, no worries. So we're really at our time. I want to, Chris, thank you very much for dialing in with us this morning and sharing the perspective of the Gates Foundation. Look, you guys do incredible work. Just say it plainly. I mean, just spectacular. And we're just so grateful to you and, of course, all of Bill and Melinda and all of the officers of the institution, because without institutions like Gates and the Howard Hughes, we need those different perspectives. I think sometimes we look and it's, well, why, to Harsha's point, why aren't there more RFP mechanisms, which, I get at a level, but, you serve a different purpose in a different way. And so kudos to everybody there. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Real pleasure.
Yeah. Okay. And thanks to the panelists, guys. Really appreciate you sharing your insight. I think you gave some good suggestions about how folks can kind of weave their way through awareness of the teams and people who are engaged and involved to raise the profile of what you do. So frankly, it rises up to a level of awareness to be incorporated in one of these great initiatives. So thanks again. I think we're taking Alejo, is that right? We have
Yeah,
a
we're taking a short 5-minute break.
5-minute break as we prep for the next presentation. So again, 5 minutes and we'll be back on with the next group, which is really talking about the Center for Disease Control and Prevention and a slightly, to some degree, broader perspective in some ways about different ways of funding from the U.S. government, and that will be followed, after lunch by comments from NIH and Fogarty. So again, thanks again. 5 minutes or now 4 minutes, and we'll start the next section. Well, welcome everyone to our second session today. Pleased to have Raven Bradley and Matt Westerkamp on from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Raven's going to kick it off. Raven is a public health analyst at CDC in the Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion. And actually, there's a lot of divisions here, so Raven's going to have to explain this in part. So she's in the Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion, the International Infection Control Program, and she's a project officer for the Global Healthcare and Resource Cooperative. And one of her main roles is to provide, if not the main roles, to provide insight and guidance from the CDC to the various contractors. Matt will follow Raven with maybe clarifying and qualifying comments. Matt's an epidemiologist also at the CDC. He's been at the CDC since 2014 and a couple of different roles, but now also along with Raven in the Division of Health Quality Promotion. And Matt is really responsible. He's the acting surveillance team lead for that program. So Raven, great to have you. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. So greetings, everyone. I hope you're doing well today. My name is Raven Bradley, and I'll be presenting on CDC's global health funding mechanisms and opportunities, particularly within IICP, so the International Infection Control Program. I'm a public health analyst in IICP, and that program sits within the Division of Healthcare Quality Promotion. And within the IICP program, I serve as a project officer for our cooperative agreement, as well as a contracting officer representative or a core for our contracts. Our division is located within the National Center for Emerging and Zoonotic Infectious Diseases, also known as NCE-ZID. As Glenn mentioned, it's a very large agency. So I thought a good thing today would be really to streamline and focus it in the area of DHQP and the IICP program. So this slide is an overview of what will be discussed today during the presentation. As demonstrated by the agenda, the purposes of today's call is to provide an overview of CDC's funding for IICP, reviewing IICP's funding priorities, discussing the different types of funding mechanisms we have, approaching the application process, outlining commonalities among successful applications, highlighting where administrative management and science meet. And then lastly, we'll talk about where you can locate some of these funding opportunities. Next slide, please. So the International Infection Control Program works to protect patients and healthcare personnel globally, particularly in low and middle income countries. We work closely with partners and countries, and we support sustainable solutions to infectious disease threats in healthcare delivery, including healthcare-associated infections, as well as antimicrobial resistance and infectious disease outbreaks. Here you see that I provided a link on this slide, so please feel free to visit our website for the International Infection Control Program, where you can learn more about the work that we do internationally. Next slide, please. So IICP's funding priorities. So we have created within our program a 5-year strategic plan. In that plan, we have 5 areas of priority that you see listed here. And so that work is really what guides the focus of our funding opportunities and the mechanisms that we're utilizing to implement different projects as well as studies. So for priority 1, this supports the goal of reducing AR and healthcare associated infections, where priority 2, the goal is to build strong and sustainable IPC programs to protect both patients and healthcare workers. Priority 3 is focused on building capacity for antibiotic and diagnostic stewardship programs. Priority 4 will be research and innovation will be used to help identify effective strategies for AR and HAI surveillance and prevention in low and middle income countries. And lastly, priority number 5 is going to work and help us protect all by rapidly identifying and responding to outbreaks abroad. So within these strategic plan priority areas, here are some areas of focus that we really prioritize in our program. Please note, not limited to these, but this really does help us guide our funding. So Global Action in Healthcare Network, which we refer to as GAIN, is a global collaborative network consisting of countries, institutions, and partners at global, regional, national, and subnational levels, working together to address critical emerging antimicrobial resistant threats in healthcare settings through rapid detection and response. We have 2 focus areas. So we have the GAIN AR and the GAIN HI, which really is just a network of networks to really be able to identify and respond to these outbreaks. Next, we have ARCH, antibiotic resistance in communities and hospitals, which the objective for this focus areas is to estimate the prevalence of and risk factors for colonization with antibiotic-resistant organisms in communities and hospitals. Other areas of focus we have is the antibiotic antimicrobial stewardship. We do environmental health care, which includes WASH, so global water, sanitation, and hygiene. And then lastly, our subject matter expertise in our program is infection prevention and control and AMR. So all of the priorities and the focus areas that I just discussed all tie into that IPC and AMR work that we're doing. Next slide, please. Listed here are some examples of research questions that align with the areas of focus that I just mentioned. Of course, these ideas and research questions aren't limited to this list, but it does provide some insight into research that supports the mission and the goals of the program. Next slide, please. So next, I want to discuss some types of funding mechanisms utilized both across CDC as a whole, as well as within IICP. So grants and cooperative agreements. So grants and cooperative agreements are utilized to provide the means to transfer federal monies, resources, technical assistance, and/or expertise to public health stakeholders in exchange for their contributions or to ensure their alignment with federal goals and objectives. So throughout the agency, sometimes we use grants, sometimes we use cooperative agreements, or what we refer to as COAGs. In IICP, we primarily fund cooperative agreement. And the reason for this, as well as the distinct difference between grants and COAGs, is there is substantial involvement from CDC when funding through a cooperative agreement mechanism. So my colleague Matt is on the call. He would help that partner work through that project of implementation, any challenges, regular scheduled meetings to help that project or that study come to life. Next slide, please. So key things to know about grants or COAGs. So one of the most important parts of these mechanisms is the Notice of Funding Opportunity, or the NOFO. It's the formal announcement of the availability of federal funding through one of its financial assistance programs. So each NOFO outlines who is eligible to apply, types of funding mechanisms, the executive summary, approximate award date, and other really important information. The key information that this document outlines provides insight on exactly what is needed to apply. It's important to always read the funding announcements thoroughly because it will provide information in various ways, so logic models, short-term, intermediate, long-term goals. It will detail the structure of what your application or your proposal should look like. And so this really does help guide the applicant when they're applying for this mechanism on what exactly is needed and what exactly CDC is looking for in this award. The application demonstrates interest, agreement, and capability by the partner and should always align with your NOFO. So next we'll discuss acquisition and contracts. This is another mechanism that we use across CDC as well as in IICP. It refers to purchasing supplies and services for CDC. Often you will hear acquisition and contracts used interchangeably. And for contracts similar to grants and cooperative agreements, instead of a NOFO, you will, there's a release of a solicitation. So this is a call for announcements, and they outline the contract's purpose, the proposal requirements, as well as submission guidelines. Next slide, please. So funding opportunities within our program. Here are some funding mechanisms that we currently have going on in IICP. All of these mechanisms are currently in progress, so we aren't adding new partners at this time. However, I think it allows us to really showcase what we have out there. You know, if program funding allows, we will continue on with these different mechanisms. So just gonna briefly kind of touch over each of these to kind of describe what they are, and then kind of be able to provide some follow-up next steps information. So for COAG that we have, one of the COAGs that we own in our program is the CK21-2104 Global Healthcare Detection and Response Cooperative Agreement. It's one that we partner with UPenn on. This is actually a non-research COAG, and it has a 5-year performance period. We are currently in year 2 and is in the process of preparing for year 3. So we partner on this project with ARCH. And so as you see, it's one of our focus areas, and it will be for the next few years to come. And next we have a contract base, which is Shepherd. Shepherd is Safe Healthcare Epidemiology and Prevention Research Development, which we named Shepherd. So Shepherd is every 5 years. So the next opportunity to be a vendor for Shepherd will be in 2025. The way Shepherd works is we release that solicitation out and we get different vendors who apply. So in that 5-year period, if a vendor is deemed technical, acceptable, have their infrastructure in place to implement some of these studies in our focus area, they will be the only list of vendors we can choose from to work with for those mechanisms of contracts that are under the Shepherd mechanism. So one good note that I really want to share with you all is always find out who the POC is in your administrative offices for contracts. That person is usually very knowledgeable. They have a touch base with these different agencies, such as with CDC, to know what's coming down the pipeline, what we're working on. And so they will just be a really good wealth of knowledge. So it's a good practice to periodically touch in with those individuals to learn about upcoming opportunities. And last, we have broad agency announcements. These also fall under contracts. So Shepherd and broad agency announcement, BAAs, are contracts where 2104 is the cooperative agreement. Our contracts also focus on our research work that we do. So the BAAs are focused around research and development. They also have a shorter time period of performance. So where a COAG is 5 years, for us, a BAA or a Shepherd contract is going to typically be between 12 and 24 months. So we also use this information for the work that we do to determine what type of mechanism we want to fund based on some of those things, like what are we looking at doing, research or non-research, time period of performance, things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so approaching the application process, many of you have either applied for funding previously, or maybe you plan to in the future. We want to share some key pieces of information that may be useful moving forward when applying for funding. So how should an applicant approach the application process? So it's important to understand and familiarize yourself with the life cycle of a mechanism's award. So that usually is pre-award, award, and post-awards. You usually find that both with grants, COAGs, as well as your contracts. Your pre-award begins when the agency plans for the solicitation through the funding announcement, as well as it ends with the applications have been reviewed and scored. So this includes your technical reviews, your objective reviews, as well as technical evaluations of your proposals. So understanding these pieces of information really helps you prepare for what you're going to be, entailed to do and what's going to be required. And when you have that kind of idea in mind, you have that plan, you kind of can structure your project or your study to move forward in an efficient way to meet these different criteria. Because for award, this is when the recipient or the partner actually receive the notice of the award or the contract is executed. So the funds are eligible to be dispersed and received. So this is also the time where you begin your project or your study. This is also the time the recipient or the partner is responsible for meeting the administrative, financial, and programmatic reporting requirements of the award. And lastly, you have the post-award. So this includes the implementation, the reporting progress, as well as completing the closeout requirements. Another applicant approach, I would say, is ensuring your organization eligibility. So always reading those solicitations and those NOFOs, because they're going to clearly outline who's eligible. You don't want to put all of that hard work into your proposals or your applications only to find out, you didn't meet that eligibility required. So always look at that first. Thoroughly reading and following all guidance outlined in the funding announcements. This is very crucial because you can have the best proposal or application in the world, but if you don't meet the outlined criteria and guidance in those funding announcements, we at the program are never going to see it and it'll never be considered for award. So making sure you read through your NOFOs and your solicitations thoroughly before you ever begin the process of drafting the application. And lastly, learning about your reporting requirements. You want to make sure if you're applying, you have the infrastructure in place and the capacity and staff to adhere to those reporting requirements. A lot of times in your solicitations and NOFOs, we have some idea of like the financial reporting as well as annual progress reports or quarterly reports we're going to expect. So usually there is some idea upfront of what's going to be required from you for reporting, but some additional reports may come along. Next slide, please. So here are some commonalities that we've observed among successful proposals or application. So organization, I think what's really key to know is a lot of times the persons who are reviewing your applications, they're having other job duties they're performing as well. So you always want to keep your application or your proposal very clear, very outlined, really succinct to the funding announcement that came out. And keeping the review criteria in mind when you're writing your application, because in those announcements, we're telling you what criteria and what scoring points are going to be given to each section. So you really want to write with that in mind, highlighting your existing infrastructure. So making sure you talk about what relationships you already have established or in place. Anything that you have already there that's going to support the proposal and application, you want to highlight that. Your budget narrative. I think this really came to mind as recently was reviewing a contract, very strong technically. They had a budget outline. However, they did not provide a budget narrative or a budget justification. And that narrative explains the estimated costs by each line item, as well as the categories in the budget, and it relates and supports to the implementation of the project or study. So if you just give us the numbers, but not a detail of if it's personnel, what are everyone's job duties? If it's travel, breaking out that travel, where are you going? What is the purpose? Really detailing that out. Because if we can't clearly see what those funds are going to be used for and how it directly relates to your application or proposal, it doesn't provide us with a full picture, and that can prohibit you from being funded for that mechanism. Early submissions, start preparing the application early and plan to submit early. I think most of us try to do that. And as we know, things happen. It can be technical issues, systems access, anything. You do want to prepare early though. We do get where a lot of people put a lot of work into these proposals and something happens and it's at the 11th hour, right there at that deadline point, and then they miss it. And once that deadline is missed, that proposal application won't be considered for funding. So I will say that is something we do see amongst successful applications. And then lastly, reach out to ask questions. In your announcements, there's usually a contact person listed. Most COACs or grants or contracts have an informational webinar. Those are great to attend, ask your questions. Sometimes an email is even provided. You want to do that because sometimes you may feel like you have just a really clear thought of what's being asked. But then what you're really answering is what you wanted to be asked and not what was the intention of what went out in the announcement. So always feel free to ask questions before you start preparing or as you're drafting your application. And even if you clear, maybe just confirming that clarity that you have. Next slide, please. So here are some outlined resources. Wanted to provide to you all where you can go to kind of really continue getting that information of applying for grants, COACs, and contracts. I provided links here. I know for a lot of our COACs and grants, they have a big evaluation aspect to them now. So utilizing the CDC evaluation framework when you're applying for CDC mechanisms, the budget guidelines, you can easily look that up online. That will provide insight around the budget narrative. And then just grants.gov, SAMS.gov that has a lot of resource videos and tips for you. Next slide, please. I want to touch a little bit on where administrative management and science meet. A good example of that is myself and my colleague, Matt Westerkamp. Matt is the surveillance lead. He is a technical lead for our program. I oversee administrative aspects of our projects. So these are really good areas to highlight to see where do we really collide and collaborate closely together for your projects. So deliverables and milestones, we're going to monitor that project together. We're going to make sure, as you're submitting invoices and things like that, those deliverables are being met. We're making good progress. For grants and COACs, you always have your work plan written out. Each year you write a work plan for the subsequent year to be funded. That's something that is reviewed through technical review by the science officer, as well as myself on the administrative side. And we're really outlining and make sure the work plan is feasible, it's realistic, and it aligns with the priorities and the focus. Next is performance, making sure we're making progress in the project and we're doing the work that we plan to implement. We know things come up, so it's just that collaboration of working through challenges together or really highlighting those lessons learned that we find out during our research. Next, risk. When you write for contracts, usually you have a section where the vendor is actually saying, these are some risks we know that may come up, and these are some ways we plan to mitigate that if they do arise. That really gives us good insight, as well as it prepares us for when things come along, we have those plans and actions and we work on them together. And then lastly, cost. So budgets, what you're outlining for supplies, does your cost make sense, and does it justify the proposal that you put in? So really wanted to give you a glimpse inside from CDC side of when we're reviewing these documents or when we're working on these projects and this research, what we're seeing and what we're doing from our end. And hopefully this will kind of give you that enlightenment as you continue to take on funding opportunities with us. Next slide, please. So best ways to learn about funding opportunities. So UPenn contract POCs in the administrative office, or even at any other respective organizations you may be affiliated with. Grants and cooperative agreement NOFOs are released via grants.gov. BAA solicitation announcements are released via SAMS.gov. There are even forecasts on both of these sites for upcoming opportunities. So you can see not only what's currently being solicited for application, you can also see what's coming down the pipeline. You must register for the site for access for both sites, SAMS as well as grants.gov. And then also ensure your passwords are current and the UEI is known, because you will need this information when you apply for any contract or grant or COAC with CDC. Next slide, please. This is my last slide, so just want to leave you with some additional tips. Remember, your application and proposals will be reviewed through several lenses. So you have technical staff looking at your proposals, logistics eyes, as well as finance eyes. And everyone's doing their review and providing those scoring. So you want to make sure you're hitting those criteria for each of those areas as you're drafting your funding opportunities. And then lastly, registering for grants.gov and SAMS.gov prior to submission, and making sure those passwords aren't expired. I just wanted to highlight that because that is something that we see often. And so just having that tipped in line, having that information ready. So once you find that funding opportunity, you're good to go. And hopefully there are no hiccups with those pieces of information. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for allowing me to present to you on some of our mechanisms and the opportunities we have and some insight of what that looks like when we're reviewing and considering partners on our end. So thank you so much. Here's myself and Matt's contact information.
Great. Thank you, Raven. Matt, did you want to add anything before we launch into a couple questions and then turn to Corrado?
Yeah, I think Raven said it really well. When I entered into the CDC system, I came from academia, and I think I came in thinking that sort of the technical review was all there was. I really reviewed I envisioned that the review of the proposals that I submitted into a system like this was very similar to peer review. And I suppose in some ways it is, but I cannot highlight how important the logistical aspects and the formatting aspects of these proposals are, because if it isn't adhered to the way it's set up, I never get to see them. And Raven and her team puts a lot of effort into making resources available, and sometimes I hope that they are utilized far better than I ever paid attention to them, because it really is important once it gets into the CDC system. So
well, I'm chuckling because like most of the folks listening, having written a fair number of grants in my day, yeah, you need to follow the directions.
yeah.
But I will say I think CDC is perhaps and I don't blame you guys at all. It's a little less forgiving in some ways than others because of more of a contract nature. And on that subject, I'm wondering if either one of you could, just for the audience, because we have a number of folks out there who are maybe not as experienced in either working with CDC or writing grants in general. Describe the basic difference between a grant and a cooperative agreement.
So I'll touch on that. Usually it really is how involved CDC will be with that mechanism. So as I mentioned, for IICP, we tend to stay closely funding with cooperative agreements because our technical teams have a lot of involvement. Where grants, you write your application of what you're going to do, and you get to implement there, and that I'm so sorry, and you get to do that, and there is check-ins, but the involvement to the degree that CDC participates varies quite differently. So that's probably the biggest distinction between the two, is when you have a grant and when you have a COAG, you will notice how different the involvement from CDC is for that funding mechanism.
And I know Corrado will touch on this. And the second question, because again, we have a lot of international colleagues listening in. And so I'm going to ask a question that I think I know the answer to, but we'll see. Are international citizens generally allowed to apply for CDC grants as the principal investigator?
So for us, our funding mechanisms we have, it's usually not an individual, but actually the organization or entity. So of course, there's always a PI highlighted or as listed as the POC for that application, but they do tend to be for your organizations and your entities. And it actually outlines what your organization criteria must be. So looking at those NOFOs and those solicitations, it's going to tell you exactly what your what criteria your organization needs to meet to be eligible to apply for that funding opportunity.
But let me broaden it, because so international organizations are allowed to apply. Yeah. So which is what I thought, and therefore they can have an international, essentially, program lead. So I think all of you, not in the US, even though it is a US government funded agency, well, assuming next week it's still a US funded government agency, right? We're going through a budget crisis in the US, as you may all have heard. Yes. So that's sorry for the the sad inside joke there, folks. But yeah, I think it just, and I want to echo one thing that Raven said, which is true of working with all the federal agencies in the US, but I think most importantly, again, for the CDC, because maybe because of the sort of the contracting nature, might be a teeny bit more rigid than some of our other ones. You got to sign up for these access sites ASAP. Get in, the grants.gov sites, et cetera. It doesn't take a lot of time, but you do need to get in there ahead of time. Second, and Raven highlighted this, because this does take a little more time. Your organization has to be qualified to apply. Very important. And because you, just as Raven said, you can create everything and you think, oh, it's okay at the last minute. No. There's a reasonable amount of due diligence that needs to be done about your organization. So, even if it's a university that is standard, et cetera, you've got to make sure that you're registered in the right way and in the right systems so that your grant can be uploaded, because everything's going to get uploaded electronically, and you got to have all the systems in place to do that. And your organization has to have the software to be able to upload it even after you're approved as an organization. So, it's, part of the deal, but it can take a little time. So, my advice on that one is just register your organization now, and then you can decide later on, are we going to apply for stuff or not? I mean, it's just a good thing in general for, if you're thinking at all about these things to do. All right. So with that, sorry, brief editorial comment there. Why don't we turn to Susan? Do I see you on there now? Hey, how you doing? Turn to Susan and Corrado. Corrado, why don't you kick it off? Because I think Susan is actually working with you now on the current project. So maybe the two of you could take a moment to describe the project that you're working on. It's a COAG, and what your interaction has, how the project got formulated, how the proposal process went, your engagement with on the ground colleagues, how that all happened. Just lay out the project for us, and to help others think through how they might develop similar kinds of similar.
Sure. Thank you so much, Glenn. So the project is called SHARE. We always have the best acronyms. It's Surveillance of Healthcare-Associated Infections and Antimicrobial Resistance, and it's been going on for almost 2 years. And I guess the acronym is self-explanatory. It's really like an in-depth surveillance of colonization and infections with multi-drug resistant organisms. Right now is in the main hospital in Gabaron, but we're about to branch out to another one of the hospitals. And it is a collaborative agreement. And I think that's been one of the most positive features of the project, is like the degree to which we work really, really closely with the CDC team. And it's a very vibrant, very constructive conversation that really allows us to sort of tweak and change what we're doing in real time based on the feedback that we give and provide. The way it started, I guess it was the perfect storm, and that's a good thing. Is that actually, if you look at the areas where BUP excels, infection prevention and control and multi-drug resistant organisms, it's really one of them.
Corrado,
yes.
Make sure, don't use acronyms.
Okay.
Others may not know what
You're
BUP
right.
is.
Yeah. Botswana University of Pennsylvania partnership, which is this long-standing partnership in Botswana between University of Pennsylvania and the government and University of Botswana. But really, one area of excellence is what this grant is about. And we had like a body of work and a lot of people who were experts who had been doing work for a long time, and we're already familiar with like a lot of the people at the CDC that we're working with, Susan being one of them, Eb Lautenbach, who is like the co-PI, being also one of them, Jonathan Strisco, who's basically running the show, also being one of them. So it was very seamless, it was very organic. And, again, I brought to the table my expertise in sort of putting together a proposal of this size and complexity, and like helping manage it. And I think it worked beautiful. It was like a very, very seamless process. And I'll leave it like that. I don't know, Susan, if you have more to add.
No, I guess the only thing that I'll add is just how satisfying it's been having a pre-existing body of work in this area of infection control and antimicrobial stewardship meet up with a really interesting project, which is the SHARE project for Botswana, which has really useful scientific aims, but I think also programmatic goals of capacity strengthening, which are right in sync with where I think most of us as scientists and as people committed to global health really feel satisfied when those two things go hand in hand. Another exciting part of it for me has been the way ongoing projects or new projects can connect to this anchor of the SHARE project. So satellite projects have been much easier to conceive, initiate, and run, and have served as a really nice way, not just to advance science in other ways related to the original proposal, but also broaden the array of people engaged on both sides of the Atlantic, both in Botswana as well as in the US. So I think I've just really enjoyed it. It really keeps true to the name of a cooperative agreement. It's really a partnership. I hope that we get to keep on spawning, related work like this. It's really quite satisfying.
Unmute, there we go. For those who haven't been involved in these projects, and I was involved somewhat in the previous, well, it was a different kind of cooperative agreement that we had preceding the current one in Botswana, but there is and Matt can probably speak to those. There's and Raven touched on it, an intimate level of interaction between the CDC, particularly the local CDC office. And I think, and Corrado, I'm wondering, because I know you've done some of this, and Matt, maybe you could touch on this, or Raven. The previous session that we had was with the Gates Foundation. We were talking about foundation work, and where it's frankly, I'm not speaking out of school, a little more challenging to sort of penetrate the organization, because it's a foundation. So they've got goals in a different kind of way than, say, a government entity. But I found that the local CDC, the in-country officers, are incredibly important people to talk to. And so maybe you could talk about that, because I think that's a way for those of you who are just starting to think about projects and you want to know what CDC is thinking, or you've got your view on what the country or the local, environment needs are. I maybe, a variety of you could speak to the importance of, I'm going to use the word because with the country directors for the CDC to kind of pick their brain, about where things are headed, et cetera, et cetera. Because should you get an award, you're going to be working with them a lot. So someone want to hit on that, or a couple of you?
I'll just touch briefly on it. It's, I think networking, at least in my mind, has a little bit of a kind of less than fully positive connotation, but it's really relationship building and helping the partners understand your perspective and what your where your passions are, what your experiences have been, what the science you've done has been. The body of work that's being produced, even in a somewhat constrained area like global health and antimicrobial resistance, is so vast that even the most motivated scientist struggles to keep track of it all. And so just sharing what you're working on and what you think the next important thing is a great way to really start building those relationships, and then listen to what the potential partner, the on the ground CDC office, is working on, where their concerns are, and what they feel they left undone. And those are often really great places to start conversations.
Yeah, can I just wanted to add to what Susan said. I mean, of course, networking, getting to relationship building, I agree with Susan, is a much better term. It's key. You know, like there's some complexity with the CDC because some grants, some awards require the country team to play a much more prominent role, and some others like not as much, but still the people in country can give you like pointers also as to what the priorities in Atlanta are. But even if let's say you're primarily like working with a team based in the US, I think liaising with the country team is incredibly important because there's already very like projects that are running in country and creating synergy and coordination. There's great value, and I'm happy to say that we've done that to a degree with the current award. Whereas like we have people from CDC in Botswana on the calls, and yeah, we're coordinating even projects. So networking, building relationships is always good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Megan.
Just really quickly, I'll say that's actually very important and a great point to highlight. I think anywhere you can find that alignment with that country office will only help support the work that you're doing and the work that we're doing overall. Sometimes even during site visit, you'll see the country office because they've been working with that partner so much, they become a part of that site visit sometimes and can really help navigate a lot of things that are, going on in country. So I think having that collaboration and that relationship can only really strengthen the project that you're working on, as well as kind of create that momentum to continue to build upon, because it's not just you as a silo on your project, but there's other buy-in investment into that project as well. Matt.
Yeah, I think I was going to kind of agree with maybe what Susan had expressed, that I am not a big networker myself. I don't like it, but I do recognize that it's important. But I also think that a type of networking that I do like is to talk about your work, look for opportunities to talk about your work, especially, I mean, in places where the CDC country office, which is often very involved in public health within the country that they're operating, is going to be taking part, as well as, your conferences and things. But having a topic of focus and putting your work out there is another way that you can sort of build those relationships. It's not as direct, but it is recognized. I know, like, individuals on this call, I know they're either them personally or their names, not so much because we've networked, but because they've put good work out there, and I know it, that it's part of it. So I think that is something else that I think is sometimes like you may not prioritize conferences in place of papers, but those can be really important areas to talk about your work.
Yeah. The other thing and maybe it's a little more for the US folks on the webinar today. The other advantage of going to see your colleagues at the CDC when you're in the various countries, and first of all, they're incredibly generous. I've always found the officers with their time. They are also very connected to the US embassies in country. And that is also important because although the embassies don't, it's a separate funding kind of deal, the embassies also often have funding streams of their own frankly, for short-term projects. They don't usually support, grants in the same way, but if there's a pet project that you can get an ambassador interested in, and particularly if you get the CDC, the local CDC country officer involved, or the regional officer, that's a tremendous way to generate seed funding and to kind of grease the wheels, in a very positive way. And I like what Susan said. It really is about relationships. I totally agree. Matt and Raven, from your perspective of the various awards you've seen, I mean, I'm going to assume, but maybe I'm wrong, that they all are intimately tied, as Corrado's, Susan's, and Ebb's project is, with in-country partners, and are with either the ministries or the universities in country. I mean, is this basically a fundamental part of making these projects go?
Good. 100%. I mean, it's always very, like, in to the point to where it's a important part of the application process itself is highlighting, and I think Raven touched on this, highlighting those existing relationships. But yeah, if it is a US sort of entity that's putting forth a proposal and they don't have strong existing relationships in country, those projects are, I mean, not even talking about the funding aspect of it, but it just the technical experts, and I think increasingly the project officers understand that those are not going to be successful projects, or they're very low likelihood of being successful. So certainly all the projects that I'm personally involved with and all the projects that I can think of within our group have very, very close ties with the country office, as you suggest, universities and in-country partners.
Good. Yeah, I thought it was kind of obvious, but I never know who's exactly listening. So I just wanted to reemphasize that point for our US colleagues, and for our international colleagues to reach out to the US partners as well, because pretty much every country around the world that I've been with, and Penn's working on over 85 different locations now, 85 different countries, multiple locations in each country. There's always going to be, partners there to help you with technical components, maybe that, if you don't have the local expertise for. If you do, fabulous. But if you don't, I would just encourage our international colleagues to reach out, whatever entity is in your domain, because, different, for both personal and historical reasons, different US entities are in different parts of the world in different countries. Just, there's little rhyme or reason to this, but it's the case. So do we have any, I think I've asked most of the questions. We have any other comments you guys would like to make before we're pretty much near the end of our time here? No, Corrado, Susan, anything? Closing comments?
No additional comments. Thank you all so much. But I think just kind of highlighting what you just said about, for our international partners, of course, our work is international work. So of course, always look for those opportunities within our divisions. And then if you are international partners, kind of building that those relationships with the US, as you said, Glenn, and then as a US partner, you're going to need that to implement those projects, on the ground in those international locations. So just really, I think you can kind of put that any limits on that, building that relationships from both sides, no matter where you are, to strengthen that application for what you submit for.
Yeah, thanks, Raven. Well, Matt and Raven, thank you both very much. Susan and Corrado, thanks for your insight as well. That's going to close out our second session. We're taking, for those of us on the East Coast, the US, we're taking a lunch break. Others are going to be, maybe if you're on the West, you're taking a late morning coffee or dinner, depending on where you are in the world. So we're going to be back on at 12:30 East Coast time. So 35 minutes from now. And that will be a discussion with folks at the NIH and the Fogarty Foundation. And then so that'll be roughly an hour conversation along with some of our colleagues who have participated in those mechanisms. That one's going to be a little broader because understandably, both the Gates Foundation and the CDC have a portfolio that's a little more infectious disease oriented, as contrasted to NIH and the Fogarty Foundation, who have a slightly broader remit. And we'll talk about that in that section. And then that section will be followed by a discussion about some internal Penn funding mechanisms, but also, I think more importantly, particularly for the international colleagues, approaches to philanthropy and fundraising with private donors and other foundations. So, okay, so thanks everyone. Back at 12:30 East Coast US time. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye. So we're pleased to have a lead presenters to begin with. Chris Klinecki, who's in essentially a component of the provost office at Penn and who manages our global initiatives program. Chris will tell us a little bit about that program, and then we're going to hear from some of the panelists who have received that funding. And then from our various development offices, Mike Hugel, Tim Grube, who's the deputy chief officer and the chief administrative officer for development and alumni relations. And Kim works a lot, and I work a lot with Kim because she focuses very much so on the centers and institutes, and it's been helping us, and we'll talk about this a little, secure some global funding. And then Tina Cowan, who's the senior managing director of development and ops at the University of Penn Central. So guys, thanks for joining us. I think, Chris, why don't we begin with you with a little bit of description of Penn's Global Initiatives Program, and then we'll move to our colleagues in development, and then we'll hit our panel.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Glenn. And before we start, I just want to say thank you, Glenn, Alejo, and all of your colleagues at CGH for putting on such a wonderful event. I've been an audience member before this panel started, and it's been a real treat to hear from our presenters and also from our panelists. So Alejo, if you wouldn't mind, if you're sharing the screen, we'll kick things off from there. Excellent. So I see a lot of new names in the attendee section that I haven't met before. It's nice to meet you screen to screen, hopefully in person one day. My name is Chris Klinecki. I use he, him, his pronouns, and I'm the Global Initiatives Program Manager at the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives. And the main thrust of my work is to manage the Penn Global Grant Program, which of course is the subject of this presentation this afternoon. A brief overview of what I'll be discussing for the next 14-ish minutes or so. First, an overview of Penn Global Services and Opportunities, especially for those of you who may not have heard of us yet. And then I'll talk a bit about the grant program overview, including our objectives of the grant program, the connection to research and engagement funds. We have 4 of those. I'll talk about that for a moment, and also the types of support that we offer. And then also share a bit about the application process, which may be especially interesting to those who are planning an application sometime in the near or not too distant future. And then finally, if there's time, I'll touch briefly on our annual special call before concluding my presentation. So first, an overview of our sort of services that Penn Global proper provides. I mentioned that I'm part of the Office of the Vice Provost for Global Initiatives, which sits essentially at the top of our org chart. We're a central point of contact between Penn Global offices and the Provost's office. We're sort of the bridge between those 2 groups. And we administer key global focus grants, such as the grant program I'm talking about today, and also the At-Risk Scholars Program, which I'm not talking about today, but I'm happy to answer questions later if any are interested. We also have global support services. They support faculty working abroad. If you have any questions or concerns about hiring overseas personnel for your projects or shipping equipment, they're able to help you with that. They also manage our international agreements and membership in international organizations. Perry Worldhouse is our convening wing of Penn Global. They offer, in addition to convenings with policymakers from around the world, they offer course development and international visitor grants and opportunities. Penn Abroad is sort of the outgoing wing of Penn Global, primarily for faculty and students who are interested in doing course-related study abroad. They have their flagship Global Seminars program, which some of you may have heard of before, as well as other opportunities, including a new one for faculty who would like to engage in longer term, so like 2 to 5-ish years in length research projects with undergraduate or graduate students helping over the summer term to help with those bits of research. Finally, International Student and Scholar Services. They are sort of our incoming wing of Penn Global for folks who are going to come either students, faculty, or scholars. They help with the visa process and support for those communities. Next slide, please. The core objectives of the grant program. So I recognize that Glenn had mentioned just a few minutes ago the importance of aligning your passion with what your funders are aiming to do, and I'm glad to bring this into focus as it engages our grant program. The first item that we look to do is developing new insights on key questions, issues, and challenges. Essentially, do you have a new idea or a new application of an existing idea that engages international partners, and will Penn and our resources play a major role in your idea? The second item that we look to do is supporting collaboration and integration of knowledge across Penn schools and centers. So are you working with Penn partners outside of your immediate lab or department or office? And then finally, strengthening equitable partnerships. So will your project be a true 2-way street with your partners abroad, and will all partners equally share the project platform with all communities engaged, obtaining positive outcomes? We do this through our 4 research and engagement funds. On the left-hand side, you see the first fund we launched in 2011, the Global Engagement Fund for really any work that happens outside of the United States. In 2015, we launched our China Research and Engagement Fund for China-specific projects. In 2017, our India Research and Engagement Fund for India projects. And most recently, the Holman Africa Research and Engagement Fund for projects engaging Africa, the African region. If you're an applicant, you don't need to know which of these 4 funds you would be supported by. If you're selected for funding, you'll be matched to the appropriate funds depending on which region or regions you plan to engage. Next slide, please. I do want to talk for just a moment about the Holman Africa Initiative. You'll see number 3 there is the Holman Africa Research and Engagement Fund, one of the 3 key components of this initiative, launched in spring 2021. Through a generous donation from Wendy Holman, a graduate of Penn, and her husband Wayne Holman, were able to support this initiative with again, 3 key sort of aspects. First, scholarship for African students in STEM fields. Second, dual research acquisition funds and a research fellowship in African health and medicine research. Those are hosted at Penn libraries. And then finally, the Holman Africa Research and Engagement Fund, which my team supports and manages. Next slide, please. We offer 2 key kinds of grant support. Click one more time if you would, to bring both of these up. We have on the left-hand side convening projects and the right-hand side research and engagement projects. Our convening projects are open to faculty, senior admins, and also certain kinds of Penn students to be PIs in the projects. We ask for sort of semester in advance applications. So if you are applying in the, for a fall convening, you apply by the spring. If you're looking to a spring application or a project, you apply in the fall, so on and so forth. These typical reward amounts don't exceed $10,000, and they support specifically convening projects. So workshops, conferences, and other convenings that are engaging one or more of our key objectives that I mentioned earlier. On the right-hand side, you see a summary of our research and engagement projects and what we do with those. Those are open just to faculty and senior admins, so not Penn students. We have an annual call for proposals as opposed to the sort of tri-annual model that we have for convening projects. Typical award amounts range from $20,000 to $150,000 total for each project across typically 1 to 4 years. That is to say, the award amount is the total award amount divided by the number of years you might be engaging. And we support a wealth of activities with these grants, including research and educational collaborations, travel, fieldwork, again, workshops, conferences, and other convenings. You can have those as part of your larger project, curricular course development initiatives, teaching and student engagement, certain service learning and social entrepreneurship, and finally, certain kinds of training and capacity building. Now, before we move on, I do want to talk just briefly about that last bullet. The kind of training capacity building that we're able to support generally needs to be tied to a specific discrete research goal or objective. So the example that I usually use is if your application is, we want to train medical personnel to be better medical personnel so they can do better in their careers. That's a little bit more open-ended. It's hard to measure whether or not you've been successful. But if you have, for example, a new training program and a pedagogy attached to that, and you'd like to test that with a group to get proof of concept, then that would be a kind of training and capacity building that we could support. Next slide, please. I want to talk just briefly about the application process, first for convening projects, and then the next slide is going to be for the research and engagement ones. As I mentioned, we have a sort of a tri-annual deadline model for our convening projects. With fall semester convenings, applications due June 1st. I promise this was not meant to be a gotcha. I know that June 1st is tomorrow, but if you do want to get an application in by tomorrow, please don't hesitate to let me know. I'd be happy to work with you. For spring semester convenings, applications due October 1st, and summer convenings, applications due February. We ask for your application 3 months or more prior to when you plan to have your convening in that semester. It usually takes us a few months to review those once we've received them. It's an internal review by Penn Global and also peer reviewers that we engage, and we're able to figure out what the decisions are going to be about 1 to 2 months prior to your convening, with funds released about 3 to 6 weeks beforehand. Next slide, please. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the research and engagement proposal timeline is an annual one, with August being the time that applications open for an 8-week call for proposals. Applications are due in early October. We do our both internal and also our peer review process over the course of the rest of the fall, with in December contacting our finalists for additional project information. I do want to mention the word finalist is a bit of a misnomer. Anybody who is contacted as a finalist in December is somebody whose project that we intend to engage and support in some way, shape, or form. And we collect additional information to help determine exactly what form that'll take and what amount that'll take. In April, we formally announce our awards to the Penn community, and in the early summer of the next year, projects are able to launch, and the first year of funding is journaled. Wanted to flag for everybody here that the fall call for proposals this year is going to run Monday, August 14th through Monday, October 9th. To be eligible for these awards, you do need to be somebody with a long-term affiliation with Penn. Again, convening proposals may also be led by graduate students, PhD students, or postdocs. You need to be primarily focusing your project outside the US or on a global issue, and our awards generally require some amount of matching funds. The ideal ratio is a 1-to-1 ratio. You can source your matching funds from anywhere internal at Penn. You can also source matching funds from any or more external groups, such as NIH, NSF, other folks that we've heard from earlier today. I also should mention that China engaging projects are required to make substantial use of the Penn Wharton China Center in Beijing, and India engaging projects are invited to collaborate with UPenn in New Delhi. If you're looking to have your application be considered for priority consideration, you'll see a lot of these things here kind of match our key objectives, and sort of, if you will, checking more of these boxes for our peer reviewers increases the likelihood that your application will be successful. We look for projects that promote interdisciplinarity and inter-school or center collaboration, ones that provide opportunities for junior faculty, so tenure track but not yet tenured. We look for, again, strong and equitable partnerships in your application, and also the leverage of matching funds. I do want to mention here too that for priority consideration, for projects engaging Africa, the Holman Africa Research and Engagement Fund specifically gives priority to proposals for sub-Saharan Africa engagement, and especially the Democratic Republic of the Congo. So if you have ideas either engaging that region or that country, please especially be encouraged to apply. Although I should mention here too, I hasten to add that you don't need to do all of these things in order to be successful. It's just that the more of these sort of boxes you're checking, the increased likelihood you'll be selected for funding. I also wanted to share just briefly the rubric metrics for our peer reviewers. As I mentioned earlier, Penn Global conducts a small sort of eligibility and internal review before we move on in the review process. It's really designed to make sure that the PI is an eligible PI, that they are able to receive funding. Our business office does a financial review. And then the substantive review, sort of the narrative work, goes to our volunteer peer review cohorts. We have a peer review process that has essentially two different steps. The first is an individual review, and once they've all submitted their individual reviews, we get together and have a debrief meeting. You see on the screen the metrics that we use for our peer reviewers to sort of grade, if you will, applications. Score of 0 to 5, so a maximum score of 50 if you're doing the math. We ask them to appraise based on their professional and scholarly experience to what extent this proposal has the chance to catalyze transformative ideas. What kind of impact might it have in the field? Is it interdisciplinary? Does it have inter-school center collaboration, et cetera, and so forth? Next slide, please. Before you apply, I would say make sure that your proposed project meets one or more of our core priorities of the grant program. Those are those 3 key objectives I mentioned at the beginning. Definitely carefully review our application guidance. So those are links to our pages for the convening grants and research projects. And then finally, you're also welcome to request a meeting with one or more of the grant program managers. That's me and my colleague, Scott Moore. I do want to mention here, Robert Gross at the last panel mentioned applicants almost needing, I think he said, an NIH-ologist sort of degree to be successful in the application process. We hope that our application process doesn't require its own degree to navigate. And while Scott and I can't write your application for you, we're standing at the ready and we're able to answer questions you might have about what generally makes an application successful, what do our peer reviewers usually look for, and what concerns might they have. We are sometimes able to catch those in drafts of applications before they're formally submitted. Lastly, I just wanted to mention we do have an annual special call. Special calls to date have sought to engage prescient global interdisciplinary topics and issues. This isn't a criteria for priority consideration. Rather, it's a way to sort of help other folks across campus who may be engaged in the topics of these special calls, A, understand that we're an available resource, or B, consider us as a resource if they haven't before. And just as a brief, sort of a brief example, in spring 2021, we piloted the special calls for projects that examine dimensions of racism and racial justice in the global context. We launched 6 projects into that call. We made it institutionalized in the fall of 2021 with a call for climate change and climate justice projects in a global context, launched 8 of those. And then most recently, our call was for projects that intend to advance or address one or more of the 17 UN SDGs. And I am pleased to report that 19 of our 19 selected projects are engaging one or more of the SDGs. And that's all I have. So I'm happy to turn things over to the next presenter and or panelists. Thank you all so much.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. And I think what I'm going to do is spend a little time with our colleagues in development, and then panelists hang in there, because I want to integrate these two domains. Because as Chris mentioned, let's put it this way. These funds just didn't materialize out of nothing. The Holman gift is a really good example. This is philanthropy that's come to Penn, just from people who care deeply about different parts of the world and the people in those locations, and are trying to work with Penn colleagues and international colleagues to bring forward funding. So Kim, Tina, and Mike, I think we don't have a presentation. We have more of an open discussion. Is that correct?
I do have a presentation.
Oh, you have a quick
Let me
one?
see if I-
Okay, Mike, go ahead.
See if I got this right.
And Mike, by the way, the letter, under your title, it's Senior Executive Director of, and for some reason I wrote "ought" instead of. That's what confused. Senior Executive
All
Director
good.
of Development and Alumni Relations in the School of Medicine. It's the "ought" that threw me off.
I think as long as everybody knows that we're involved in fundraising, and to give us a call when you need help.
There you go.
Whatever the title says, if we get to that end, that's
All
fine.
right. Thanks, Mike.
So Kim, I think you wanted to kick us off, right?
Yeah, so actually, I was going to kick us off, Glenn, and
Okay, great.
yeah. So I'm Kim Gruby, and I serve as the Deputy Chief Advancement Officer for Penn Med Development, and so I help oversee all of our fundraising activities. And you know that joining me are Mike Hugel and Tina Cohen. And so we're going to talk with you a little bit today about how our offices in development can assist you. We're a little bit different than a traditional funding agency. And so we thought that the best way to begin might be with an example of how we recently assisted the Center for Global Health. We're thinking that this will help illustrate how we can most effectively partner with you. Let's see. Thank you for advancing. I'm sure everybody here watches the news and is well aware of the devastation that is taking place, unfortunately, every day in Ukraine. And back in the fall, our office was contacted by Glenn and by PJ Brennan, and they asked if we could help identify some support for a small group of surgeons who were going to travel to the Ukraine to help train their surgeons in limb-sparing surgeries. This group had been doing virtual trainings for several months, but had done as much as they could do online and really needed to be in person for the more advanced techniques. And for a variety of reasons, we couldn't do a mass appeal. So this needed to be targeted asks to a few individuals. And within days, we had actually secured a major gift from one of our donors in Europe who felt quite passionate about this cause and wanted to give back. So he wrote a check to the fund, or to fund the entire mission, which was conducted in Germany in December. And we're now stewarding this donor through reports, and hopefully he will continue to donate to this program and other programs for global health in the future. And so ultimately, I would say we were able to match a compelling project and vision with a donor who had similar interests. And really at the heart of things, this is what we do. So if you want to go to the next slide, Mike. Thanks. So what is development? In short, we're an office that raises money to support the tripartite mission of Penn Medicine. We fundraise for research, for education, for patient care priorities. Much of what we do is domestic based, but as our example shows, we also raise money for global projects that advance Penn Medicine's mission. I would say that we have multiple bosses in development. We serve as advocates for our donors. So many of those donors are alumni of Penn, but many are non-alums, whether they're patients or non-patients. We refer to this group as friends. So we connect routinely with alumni and friends to learn about what interests them, what motivates them to give. And then we meet regularly with faculty and leadership to remain informed of their priorities. And we serve as the conduit between those various parties, matching interests to build up philanthropic support for Penn Medicine. So ultimately, we are working to support meaningful relationships between donors, faculty, and leadership, and building a culture of giving back. And so with that, I'm going to hand the floor over to Mike, and he's going to get more into the mechanics of our frontline team and the important units in development like communications and research that form the backbone of our work.
Thank you. So just I want to put one thing into scale too, is that the development office at the university, across the university, is quite a large enterprise, and it's a very professional group as well. There are about 650 people across Penn who are dedicated to doing development work at Penn, and there's about 140 of us that are part of the Penn Medicine effort. That means 140 of us that are strictly focused on Penn Medicine priorities. We do work across different units, and we're trying to do more and more of that. And certainly under the new leadership of President McGill and the Vice President for Development, Jim Husson, that we're entering into a more collaborative era, which is very promising for us. Tina and I have worked together a lot on different projects. She can talk a little bit about her role as we get to the end of this, but I think that that's very helpful as we try to look for these broader projects. And then just the last thing I really want to say is that, just to give you in context, as of was last Friday, we reported that the university had raised about $605 million in philanthropic support this year. And I'm really proud to say that Penn Medicine represents about $318 million of that total. So we're having a really terrific year, and with promise to continue down that path. In terms of the function of the development team, we're really sort of broken down into these sort of four major categories, which are gift officers, people such as myself and the staff that I have, which are really what we call frontline fundraisers, or you can think of them as frontline salespeople, if you would, who are out there trying to identify donors, understand what their interests are. We also meet with faculty. We meet with faculty who come to us to get a better understanding of what they're looking for. And our goal is to really connect those two interests, if you would. In the session before, I caught the tail end. One thing that Glenn had mentioned is to follow your passion as faculty members and to line up your work with people who share your interest. And that really resonated with me, because that's really what we're trying to do. We want this to be a very positive experience. So that's what our gift officers are doing, is really sort of acting as brokers, I guess is a way you can say it, of trying to build these relationships. But in order to make all of this happen, we also have these other functions on our team, one of which is a communications group. So obviously all faculty know how to put together projects and write and grants and things like this, but we have a team that puts these things together into donor speak, if you would. So maybe a little bit more toned down, not as detail oriented, a little salesy, but it's really put together so it appeals to the donors and the donor interests. That's on the proposal side. Once the gift comes in, and we always expect the gift to come in, we write thank you letters, acknowledgement letters that come from could potentially come from you, it could come from Glenn, it could come from other members of senior leadership up to the president, depending on the amount. And then, of course, as these gifts, as we benefit from them over the years, we'll write what Kim had mentioned before, stewardship reports. So, for example, for the donor who helped us from Ukraine, we want to make sure that they're up to date on what we're doing, what we're continuing to do. The side of this is that we want to make sure they know we spent their money well and keep them interested in case there's another project that comes along. So it's a cycle, if you will. We also have a function in our office that we call research, and they do, sort of two really important things. One is to look at the potential of some of the donors or prospects that we're looking at, to make sure, or to understand where their wealth comes from. This is all above board, all public record, of which there's a lot of information now. So it's becoming quite a sophisticated operation now that's able to look at this data that's out there, get a rough summary of what they have, and then give us a rough idea of what their gift potential is. This is important because when we go in to make an ask, we want to make sure we're asking somebody at the appropriate level, that we're not asking for too much, but we're also not asking for too little. Donors are interesting. Some will be very forthright about what they want to do. Some will take a little bit of time, but it's important to know what field you're playing in, if you would. The other thing that I think is important, and I've benefited this personally when I did international work at Wharton, is looking at risk assessment, if you would. So I've been approached a lot of times when I was at Wharton. I have some very colorful stories about people who want to make some very big gifts. And as you dig into them a little bit further, you realize these are people we probably don't want to work with. Some are very high profile now, some are on the run. Happy to talk about that offline if you want to ever hear some interesting stories. But I'm always thankful that we did walk away from those opportunities. And the last thing is very process oriented. Whenever the gifts come in, basically we have the function to be able to take the checks in, put them in the right accounts, and make sure that you get the money. So that's what's happening. Again, what we talked about is really this is a partnership. We work very closely with our faculty. We work very closely with other centers and administrators across campus to really build up the right relationships, that we understand your projects, and that we're able to translate them out to our donors. What we'd really love to ask you to do is to think about this process when you're out there. So whether you're at a conference or you're in a social function, and at any point is think about this, because oftentimes people will drop hints about their interest. Once you start talking about your project, what you're doing, there may be some interest in, hey, I might want to fund that. Maybe not directly, but think about those relationships and how those things develop, and feel free to share those with us. And we also work with you to talk about how to tell your story, right? We want to make sure that you're pitching it, if you would. We refer to it as a bit of an elevator speech. Sometimes the elevator ride can be long, sometimes it can be short, but just to be able to come up with a way to think about how to put that project out there in a way that's interesting to your donors. So this is just a quick slide on the whole process of how we work. Again, we identify and qualify people and check them out. It's about building the trust between the prospect and us, looking at what their passions are, looking at, again, as we mentioned before, we want to identify people who share your passion, who want to work with you and want to work in your space and achieve the same goals. And about matching those passions. We engage the donors. Once we get their commitment, once we get their trust, we want to make sure we put the appropriate ask out there. And then the cycle completes with us stewarding them, making sure that they get the right reports, know we're spending money. And by the way, that's not just reports. Sometimes we bring them to campus. If there's a lab or something like this, we want them to visit. If it's an international project and it's appropriate, maybe they want to visit the location where you're doing the project, et cetera. So that's just a quick thing on the cycle. And we'll share these slides. Sorry, Alejo, we didn't get these to you. We made last minute changes all the way through yesterday. So we'll get these out to you so you can share them. So in terms of the next steps is how to get started is, one is to think a lot about your projects, what you want to do, reach out to us, figure out, we'll work with you, figure out what the projects are, talk to you about what potential interests are. We'll work to make sure that your pitches, if you would, are in the donor speak, or we'll work with proposals or decks or whatever it is that you need. Again, we know everybody who's involved in this on the faculty side, you obviously understand the science and the research and things. Sometimes it helps us just to, when we work with you, is to get it a little bit into simpler terms so we can get the conversation started and just get to that initial point. If they see that there's certain areas that they're very interested in, then we can dig into the deeper detail, but we want to be able to put something that's a little bit more sales appeal, if you would. All right, so I think, Kim, you wanted to talk about the London group next, correct? I'm sorry, the Global Council. Sorry, it's evolving, folks.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, in 2019, we were working with UPHS leadership, and we formed a council in London to evaluate what kind of clinical presence we might want to have there. That council is comprised of some very influential people from throughout the world. In fact, it was one of those members who stepped up to fund the Ukraine project we talked about at the beginning. And another member of that council has worked to feature the work of Dr. David Fagenbaum at some very high profile international donor meetings. So they're very active, very helpful. Now in 2023, we are pivoting that council away from advising on clinical strategy. It will, going forward, be known as the Penn Medicine Global Council. We're moving forward to having those individuals serve as ambassadors to promote Penn medicine globally, to focus more on research and education, and to help inspire additional support from throughout the world for Penn medicine's mission. Ultimately, this group is directed by Dean Jameson and supported through our development office. So I would just say that going forward, this will be a terrific group to keep informed of our work globally, and when appropriate, to call on them for assistance. I think it's a great way to just advance the work that you're doing. And I think that that's our last slide, and we could now turn things back over to Glenn for a conversation.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And I'm glad Mike touched, Kim, I'm glad you began with the Ukraine example, and Mike, I'm glad you touched back to the comments that initially Robert Gross and then I made in the prior section, because actually, you know, getting grant funding and philanthropy, not so different. Actually, I mean, you have to have you know, a passion in an area. You have to find the funder, that is the donor, and you have to align your interests and your passion with theirs. And in the end, you know, none of it works unless you've got a great project and you're going to really do some good somewhere. And as Kim described, that's exactly what happened with the Ukraine project. It was a really interesting discussion. And I want to say that, you know, there's always a balance in my experience in cultivating donors between, you know, and much of it depends on just how knowledgeable they are. And this is not just for Penn people, but actually, you know, those of you listening on, you know, in the webinar who are in, you know, non-US locations, you know, I hear all the time, there are just a couple countries in the world where philanthropy is a tradition. The United States, Israel, for example, the UK to some degree. You know, what I have found is that there are people of means in every country of the world, and very commonly, those people want to give back. They feel fortunate because of the resources they have, and they're actually looking for ways. So cultivating individuals, as Kim and Mike were saying, I know, you know, Tina supports, you know, it's developing a relationship with them. But there's a balance between informing them and trying to kind of suss out where their passion lies, because sometimes they know, sometimes they don't, and you got to kind of feel things out. And then actually making the ask, because I've heard on a couple of occasions, and this actually happened with the donor of the Ukraine project, Kim, I don't know if you remember. We were in his office and he said, "So what are you asking me for?" And I actually heard that from the biggest donor ever to Penn Medicine. Ray Perlman said, you know, I was chatting with him about something, and so he ended up naming, so it's the Perlman School of Medicine, right? I mean, he gave this enormous, he and his wife and family gave this enormous gift to us. God bless them. And I remember him saying to me at one point, you know, I was sitting in and nobody was telling me what they were asking for. He said, you guys need to be more direct. So don't be shy. I guess my point is, you got to do it at the right time, but you shouldn't be shy about making an ask. Even if it's not an exact amount of money, we would like you to support the following thing, you know, once you've sort of figured that out. And I think that is just super, super important, these, you know, as the guys were saying, the relationships. I do want to engage our panel, and so I'm going to ask Heather, Ricardo, and Vanessa to chime in a little bit. Heather, are you on?
I'm here.
Plus, wait a minute. And someone told me you're leaving Penn?
I am.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Fairly recent news. Yeah, I'm headed to Cornell.
Oh, well, good for you. We'll miss you, but good for you. So Heather is an economist, actually, and she's currently, I guess I'll say, in our Department of Policy and Medical Ethics. But Heather, you've had funding from the Penn resources. Maybe you can talk about, you know, how you use those funds, what they've spun into, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I should say thank you to the Penn funding sources that we've had. They have just been invaluable to my work. The main ones that I've gotten are some of the funds that Chris highlighted earlier. I think they've actually funded 5 projects, so thank you for that. As well as the Quartet piloting funds, which have also been very, very helpful. Those have a few more restrictions on how they can be used, but they're also a very valuable source with internal to Penn. I would say broadly, the way I tend to use those funds is piloting. So often what you're looking for is a way to kind of get some base evidence that you can then take to a bigger funder and say, hey, look, we have some evidence that this could work. Can you put a lot more money behind it? So as a concrete example of that, one of the projects that Penn Global funded for us was a project studying loneliness among migrant workers in India and trying to understand whether that's a major driver of short migration spells, which can really kind of limit people's economic opportunities in that context. So we ran a pilot using that funding. We then leveraged that pilot data to get another, I think, $750,000 from USAID. And now we're running the full study using that money. And I think that type of design is often very helpful because those funders, it's a lot of money to throw at an idea. But if you have some data behind that idea, they look at it much more favorably.
Yeah.
And so that's something that's kind of worked very well from my side.
Yeah, well, thanks, Heather. Vanessa, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your project. Vanessa is a pediatric critical care fellow based at Children's Hospital, but has been working a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. Is Vanessa on, Vallejo?
Yes, I'm here.
Hey,
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
And thank you, Chris, and to the Global Health team for funding our project. My research mentor is Vinay Nakarni, who's also a full-time faculty at Penn. And our project looks at improving septic shock outcomes in Kumasi, Ghana. We're basically using a telesimulation program in conjunction with the Annenberg School of Communication at Penn to help train their ED pediatric providers in how to address and recognize shock. And the funds have really helped us to perform our initial needs assessment throughout the Kumasi region and have been able to help us improve their shock outcomes by implementing this new telesimulation platform, by helping them get Wi-Fi access within the hospital, and also to help us work with the local university and putting together a research assistant team as well. So we're still in the preliminary phases, but we've already seen good outcomes so far in terms of our needs assessment.
So thanks, Vanessa. I think, guys, and those listening in, and one of the questions that I answered already sort of in the Q&A comment that came up, someone said, well, why is Penn just funding these, why India, why China, why Sub-Saharan Africa? And that's the donor passion in a large way, where their focus interests lie. And Chris commented on this even in the Sub-Saharan Africa, there's, interest particularly in the DRC. So you've got to align in these different kinds of ways. And I think as the projects move forward, Heather's is a really great example. She's done, a lot of work in India over time. You've got Ghana. Those are opportunities actually to spin those in time by working with our colleagues in development, keeping people aware and abreast of what you're doing, because particularly in a country like the United States, our multi-ethnicity and our backgrounds are strengths in many ways, but one of them is individuals, feel passionate about giving back to, the origins, from their heritage. Ricardo is kind of one of the more interesting Penn faculty, I feel, both a veterinarian and a researcher, very interested in One Health projects. We first actually supported Ricardo as a postdoctoral fellow when he was in Peru, working with Mike Levy, and Ricardo did, of course, fabulously well, and is now a member of our faculty, epidemiologist. Ricardo, you want to say maybe a little bit about your projects?
Yeah, thank you, Glenn. So I received a global engagement fund. So thank you to the Penn Global team for that. And what I can say is that I've tried before to get seed funds and I wasn't successful. And I think that the problem is that I knew what I wanted for my pilot. I didn't know what I was going to do later with those data. But with this global engagement fund, I knew that that was a crucial piece of my KO1, to present my KO1 with some data and to show feasibility. Because I work on rabies, dog rabies, which is still present in some Latin American countries. And I wanted to understand in these cities how dogs move and how that affects the epidemic of rabies when it is present. So I needed to put GPS collars on these free roaming dogs, which a lot of people thought that wasn't feasible. So I used the Global Engagement Fund to do that, to build that data.
Yeah, guys, going back to our colleagues in development, how do you see, Ricardo's is another really great example. There's a heck of a lot of dog lovers out there, and he's dealing with, these emerging problems, which, I think rabies is endemic in Bolivia, right? Just south of Peru. And of course, the dogs are sometimes migrating up as the mining industry has started to explode in Peru. And during the pandemic, he actually had some really exciting data along with this graduate student on what happened during the pandemic, which is that, not surprisingly, because the immunizations of the dogs diminished, rabies expanded in the region. So, how do we get, guys, how do we connect more individuals? It isn't just, the Glens of the world who have access to you guys. How do we connect more of the frontline faculty and our international colleagues working with our frontline faculty to bringing forward proposals in a way that doesn't, frankly, overwhelm the development folks with just, tons and tons of requests?
Well, we like to be busy, so having lots of requests is helpful. So I think, Glenn, to your point, and Tina, I want to make sure everybody understands her role. So Tina is part of the central development team, whereas Kim and I are based in Philadelphia, and we're here in Philadelphia most of the time. The fact that Tina's sitting behind a map, in front of a map, that's her office. So that's where she goes, her and her team, and they cover all the major cities where we have alumni. The point is Glenn, to your point is that there are alumni all over the world that are interested in different projects. And this is where it becomes this two-way street we talked about in some of my slides. Whereas if there are projects we know that you're interested, or you have projects, if you let us know what they are, particularly Tina, because she's out there, Tina may be out there connecting with somebody who has that very interest, and it could come up in any kind of conversations. Or she may be contacted by somebody that says, I'm really interested in this. And then we come back to, maybe we'll start with Glenn or somebody, and just said, somebody's interested in a project in Indonesia around this. Do we have anybody who's interested in this? Now, we know broadly we have some interest in the areas. We know what our capabilities are, but there may be some specific things. So that's where this open dialogue really, really becomes important. So Tina, I don't know if you wanted to comment a bit more on that.
No, thanks so much, Mike. And it's a pleasure to be here. But as Mike said, we're so fortunate in that we work sort of around the globe, sort of in countries all over, interact with alumni, parents, and friends. And the more that we know, the more stories we have to tell about the work that Penn does. Very often, the further we get away from Philadelphia, the more interested people are in hearing stories about local impact too. So knowing that Penn Medicine is in a particular country doing work, it's a really good place to start. Now, it may be that they're not interested in that particular project, but it starts a dialogue and makes them aware of it. And then it's sort of a ripple effect from there. So it is very helpful. But I would just underscore what Mike said. It is this sort of two-way street. And, not every project leads to private philanthropy, but the more we know, the bigger the chance.
Can I also jump in and just say a few words about our relationship with chairman and faculty and center directors? So Glenn, you had mentioned kind of, managing the workload that comes with multiple faculty requests. The way we tend to do our work, I think Mike might have mentioned this, in our office, the frontline staff all have different departmental and division assignments. So every department at Penn Medicine has a development officer assigned to them. And that development officer meets routinely with department chairmen, with center directors. Oftentimes we go to departments and divisions and we give presentations on our work and encourage the faculty to get involved, educate on the process as we did here today. When faculty contact us with projects that they're interested in seeking philanthropy for, one of the first things that we'll do is we'll go back to a department chairman or a chief and just make sure that everybody's expectations are aligned. So I feel like that's an important part of the process too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I do think, as time has gone on, and a lot of thanks to Chris and Zeke, Emmanuel, and Amy Gadsden and others in the Penn Global office for curating, the global funding initiatives. That, as Ricardo was saying, and and true for Heather, and I'm sure coming forward for Vanessa, the global funding is actually very, very difficult to come by traditional means. And it's in fact why we ran today's webinar. So we began in the morning with folks from the Gates Foundation. They're very, very focused on prevention early intervention and access. And God bless them. I mean, they do a fabulous job. And a lot of it is infectious disease focused. Then we had conversations with folks at the Center for Disease Control, again, largely infectious disease focused. And then just before this session, we were talking to folks more generally at the NIH. But in fact, there isn't a lot of global funding out there. And so I think, increasingly philanthropy can play a bigger role. And Tina, I was just wondering, as you were saying this, and overlaps, Mike, with your comments, and maybe it's kind of a unfair question the way I'm going to phrase it, because the history is, maybe not, maybe we haven't been aggressive enough, let's put it that way, in touting all the great things we've been doing globally. How common is it actually that an alumni who's living abroad, maybe, is international by origin, and who's living abroad would actually prefer to give somewhere in their domain as opposed to giving back to Penn? Because the tradition, so I've been at Penn for 37 years. In the old days, it was always money to Penn, money to Penn, money to Penn, as contrasted to money for Penn to be able to contribute around the world. So what's your perspective on donors and how frequent it is that they actually would prefer not, oh, Penn's already got a lot of money,
I mean, I think we continue to see extraordinary levels of support from alumni across the globe to money for Penn. I mean, and many of our undergraduate alumni are very eager to support things like undergraduate financial aid, but with a preference for a student from their region or their country. But I think as Penn has gotten much more bold in talking about its global outreach and the impact that we have around the world, the more we're seeing an interest from alumni who are very interested in how can they, through Penn, also see an increase in what's happening where they are. But it's very individual. I mean, we have people in Hong Kong who have supported research or patient care at Penn Medicine that are very interested in a particular area. And then we have like the Holmans are US-based donors, but people I worked with in my former job at Penn in the library and got to know well, and they had a particular interest in Africa. So it's all about, I think both Kim and Mike said, it's really about finding their interest and their passion. But we're definitely seeing that more and more alumni are willing to support another part of the world in addition to the US. I also think as geopolitical climate as such that the donors sometimes get some scrutiny if they send too much money to the US. The fact that they could support Penn, but in country or through a gift that supports their home country is really attractive to certain donors.
Yeah, I know this happens a lot in India, actually, both, well, certainly the Indian government funding, but even for philanthropy, I know there's a lot of and I get it completely. I mean, sure. So, I think the more that we can do this, the better. So look, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank everybody so much for participating today. Encourage our faculty, trainees, both the folks at Penn and the folks internationally, to think more actually about how to use these seed mechanisms to generate pilot data to make the the bigger awards to NIH and Gates, et cetera, more competitive, but also to think more about the role of philanthropy in your research, because Penn, as you've heard from Mike, raises a lot of funds. And, if you look at the proportion of that goes to global health and global related activities, it's still a relatively small piece of the pie. So I think we've got a lot of room to grow without squeezing out others, because we just want to make the pie bigger by making better and more compelling stories. And that's what we've seen over the last couple. I think if we look at the last decade, we haven't taken away from one group by adding something else. We've just brought more people, under the Penn umbrella. So again, thanks everybody. Have a great afternoon. And
Thank you.
Those of you abroad, have a good evening.